This video is made possible by Envato Elements. Stick around to learn how you can save 50% on an annual subscription. Hey, it's Jake, and today I want to do something a little bit different. I want to learn something. I've got this After Effects logo animation template that I got online, and I kind of just want to dissect it and see how the original artist created it, see if there's anything that I can learn, and if there's anything that I think I might do differently if I were to design the template. Let's take a look. So this is the template file that I'm going to be walking through. It's an animated logo reveal. It was designed by Snezko Rex, I think is how you say that, but I got it on Envato Elements, and I just want to open it up in After Effects and see how it works. So let's go ahead and jump in. So over here in After Effects, we have a standard looking After Effects template, which if you have any experience with After Effects templates, they generally are really complicated to adjust. It's pretty much what you see is what you get. You can swap out your logo, and that's about it. So I want to take a look and see how this designer created the template, see if they made it flexible enough so that somebody who actually understands After Effects could go in here and start tweaking things. The folder structure is pretty organized. We have this holders folder with a logo and text holder, project control, music, and render me. So a render comp, and then a folder that says elements do not edit for everything that's behind the scenes that the artist didn't want you to touch because it will break the template. And we're definitely going to be looking at that. But it does come with a handy little PDF from the artist that explains exactly how to customize it. So they're saying in the holders folder, that's where you can place your text and logo. It also claims that you can change the project to whatever project settings you want. It also says there's a project control composition where apparently we can change the project settings. We'll take a look at that. And if you want to put music in, go ahead. So in my experience, this is actually really common where the project file is set up for somebody who maybe doesn't understand After Effects, doesn't want to understand After Effects. All they want to be able to do is grab their logo and stick it in, maybe slide in some music and hit render so that their logo is animated exactly the same way that the preview video was. But in the past, I've been asked by clients to take a template, put their logo in, and then modify things about it. And the way that the project was built was just a nightmare to try and reconstruct and tweak and figure things out. It really got to the point where I had to just strip everything back and almost rebuild it from scratch because it was just so complicated to work exactly that one way and no other way. Now, before we get into this, I want to tell you a little bit about this video's sponsor, which is Envato Elements. Envato Elements delivers unlimited access to over 55 million assets like fonts, photos, video templates, WordPress themes, and even Adobe templates. It's a truly massive library, and it's such an invaluable resource as a designer to be able to just grab anything that I need whenever I need it. They offer a super simple license that counts even after your Envato Elements subscription is ended. And if you use the link in the description to sign up for an annual subscription, you'll save 50% off, which is giving you access to millions and millions of assets that Envato Elements offers for less than $20 a month. And for someone who works for themselves, being able to get access to so many high quality assets at such a little price per month, it's just a no-brainer. So be sure to check out that link in the description, and thanks to Envato Elements for sponsoring this video. So why don't we take a look in After Effects and stick a logo in here, see how it works the way that it's intended to, and then see how difficult it might be to actually change some things to customize it. So I've brought my logo in, and I want to change this to sort by type. So it's alphabetical but organized by type. So my logo is down here at the bottom. Let's go into the logo holder comp, and we have the Envato logo, which is the placeholder, and then a guide. So if you remember the way that this is animated, the logo kind of is centered in these circles. So that guide that we're seeing in After Effects is to kind of show us where the logo will be in relationship to those animated lines. And then these brush strokes slide in and everything else fades away except for the logo. So that's a good visual guide to have there, and it is a guide layer. It's locked, so I can't change it, but it won't render. So let's just go ahead and swap this out. I'm gonna select that, click and drag this while holding Alt or Option on the keyboard, and then that will swap the sources. But the original logo was actually scaled down, so I'm gonna scale this up to fit inside that circle a little bit better, and maybe shift it over just so it fits that circle a little better. All right, and I'm noticing motion blur is enabled. That is something that will definitely slow down the entire project. But if I jump over to the render me comp, then I can kind of play this back, and we'll just see, I'm looking at this at half speed. It's rendering pretty quickly until this point, and suddenly it's not anymore. So I have a feeling After Effects was rendering some of that in the background, but also that could be where some effects are happening on top of that comp revealing my logo, which could definitely slow things down. But I'll just play this through and edit it out and then we'll take a look. All right, so let's take a look. The logo comes in. Very cool. Works. All right, so at this point, a lot of people are probably going to be like, awesome, that's perfect. They'll change their text. Obviously, we'll go into the text holder. I could say Jake in motion. I could change that font if I wanted to. Let's say Balboa. And the website, www.jakeinmotion.com. All right, very straightforward. That updates in here. If I go into 100%, it does take longer to render, and that does look pretty janky. I'm a little surprised by that, but overall, it does work as intended. It ends up with my logo and the text, and obviously I can change this text if I want to fill out the space a little bit more, maybe using a different weight for my actual title. But there we go, works as advertised. But what I want to know is how this was actually built, because we have this one big project control comp. And if you remember back in the PDF, if I go into that project control comp, I have some options. So let's take a look at what options we actually have. We have color control, and this is just a null object with color expression controls. So it's giving me options for the first background and second background. So let's figure out what that means. If I turn this to a different color, okay, so that's the background for the first part of the animation, and then near the end, that all wipes away. Okay, so we could have two colors. We could have a second background color that's more of the color of my brand, something like that. So those are nice controls. I'm gonna undo that. We've got the grid color, so I'm assuming that's all of these elements here. Let's just make it like a cyan and see what happens. Yep, so those are all of the lines except for some of the ones that are textured. I guess that's probably lines 1 and 2. Cool, so these are all great little color controls to be able to customize this to fit your brand or just to give it a different feel. Maybe you wanted to give this more of like a blueprint feel. We could make the background paper like that. We could change the line color to be white, including this color here and this one. And now it's got more of a blueprint feel, and that was really easy to do. We've got logo edge color. So if I zoom in here, you see that there's an outline version of my logo. So if I change that edge color to white, then it's going to fit this blueprint feel a little bit better. Now, I was expecting my logo to fit within this circle, since in the logo holder there was a guide that had the circle in it, but it is not lining up. So I'm going to scale that down a little bit more and then take a look at that again. There we go. Now that fits a little bit better. We've got text edge. So same thing. We've got an outline view of that. I'll make that white. And that text color is going to be the final revealed version of the text. So right here, so maybe I want to make that something that fits my brand a little better. And there we go. Now it definitely looks like some grain was added in here. Motion blur is enabled. I definitely saw some depth of field. So all of these things stacked together look really nice, but they also slow the render down. And that's a constant struggle when designing a template, figuring out a good balance of render time with render quality. A lot of times you want to add a bunch of effects and cool depth of field, but if that's going to make a single frame take 10 seconds to render, you got to decide if that's worth it. And I think that kind of depends on what the template is for. If it's a logo animation like this one, then you're probably only going to be rendering it out one time or not that often. So having an hour-long render, if it takes that long, isn't really a problem. But if it was a lower third that you want to set up as a Mogurt inside of Premiere that can just kind of render on the fly, then render time is a really important factor for your template. So if you're looking to get into building templates, these are things you're going to have to think about. You can't just throw every single effect that you want on there with a ton of depth of field and 3D objects and who cares how long it renders, because you're designing this template for a customer, for someone else, and you want to give them the best experience possible when they're using your product. Now, I'm not trying to discredit this artist in particular because, like I said, this is a logo animation. You're probably not going to need to render it out a whole bunch of times, so render time isn't necessarily that big of a deal. Just something to keep in mind when you're creating templates. So let's take a look at what other controls we have here. We have project control with some checkboxes. So first of all, we have curves on and off. It's off currently, so let me check that on. Okay, so that's literally a curves effect, and it looks like that's just making everything a little bit more dark, which is interesting. It's also affecting the color of my my final screen. And actually there's a shape layer right here named curve. So if I just take a look at that, it looks like an S curve there and a little bit of a color shift too. If we go to the red, green, and blue channels, red and green are left alone, but the blue shadows have been lifted and the highlights have been dropped down a little bit, which is why it's a lot more yellow That's what this effect is going to do. So that's really just a color curves, like a color grade. So I would probably have labeled that differently, just said color shift, but that's just my opinion. And this is actually something that we can learn from. So take a look at all of these shape layers here and how they're labeled. This is actually an adjustment layer. If you didn't know, any layer in After Effects pretty much can be an adjustment layer because it's just a switch. You can enable that for a solid, for a shape layer, text layer even, and it will become an adjustment layer. And the reason why you might want to use a shape layer as an adjustment layer in a template file is because you have access to the rectangle's size, which you could use expressions to tie to the size of the comp. So if the user, the customer who downloads your product, changes the size of the comp, the adjustment layer would automatically scale to it. That would be more difficult with an actual solid, which is what a default adjustment layer is made from. So using the size property to size to the comp is just a really easy way to make sure that your adjustment layers work across different resolutions. And this artist didn't use that expression on the size for this adjustment layer, but they did use an opacity control tied to that checkbox. So it's just a simple if-else expression to check if you've used this checkbox or not. If it's on, then the opacity is 100%. If it's off, then the opacity is 0. And I'm sure the same thing will apply to these other options. So we have a vignette on and off. That's again an adjustment layer down here. My only guess as to why the curves is unlocked is because this way you can change the color control yourself. You can adjust that grade if you want to. I'm guessing the artist didn't want you messing with. But if we take a look, it's again just an adjustment layer using curves and levels with a soft feathered mask to create that shape. So nothing too complicated there. We've got sharpen on and off. So let me zoom in here. I thought it did look a little bit crunchy, and sure enough, that's where that sharpness is coming from. It's this checkbox on an adjustment layer, which uses not only a sharpen effect, but also noise. So that's an interesting choice. Noise definitely slows down renders a bit, but it gives it a look, and you have the control to turn it on and off. So I'm just gonna disable that to see if it renders a little bit more quickly. We have camera lens blur on and off. So let's take a look at that. This is an adjustment layer with camera lens blur. That effect is notoriously slow to render, but it produces amazing looking results. If I back this up to that initial camera move, there's some depth of field. So is this what is driving that depth of field? It is not. So that's interesting. This actually must be using a 3D camera with depth of field. We'll take a look at that. But I want to figure out what this camera lens blur is actually driving. So let's see if we can figure this out. And there's actually a camera lens blur strength, so I'm just gonna bump this up to 20 so it's really crazy high. We can better see what's actually happening. So now that I'm on this frame, maybe it's this kind of vignette camera lens blur. If I turn that off and on, sure enough, there it is. So it's blurring out the outside radius of the frame, kind of like a vignette, but we're doing it with this camera lens blur. Again, it does a really nice job of producing really great looking out of focus areas, but it does create a render hit. So I'm gonna set that back down to its default of 5, turn that on and off, so you can see that it's just pulling focus to the center of the frame. And it is a nice effect. Now this is not using a feathered mask like before. That wouldn't actually create a fall off of blurriness. So let's take a look at the blur map and see that it's layer number 9 blur map. So let's go into that. And sure enough, it's just a very simple vignette. So again, using a shape layer and a gradient fill, we go from white to black. And that's how the camera lens blur effect is operating. Wherever that blur map is white, things are in focus, and as it gradually fades into black, it becomes more and more out of focus. So that's a nice little use of camera lens blur. And that's all of our project controls. So at this point, we've looked at and touched everything that this artist intended for us to touch. And now I want to kind of just dive in a little bit deeper and see how more of this was created. So let's go into this Elements Do Not Edit folder and take a look at the composition comp, because I'm pretty sure that's what's going to have the majority of this template file inside of it. And yeah, this looks more like a standard After Effects composition with a bunch of layers, track mats, 3D camera, and let's figure out what these CC1 and CC2 layers are. So they're null objects, no effects applied, so they're not controlling anything with expressions, but it looks like they're actually controllers for objects in the scene. So if I move this around, the camera is moving with it. So maybe CC stands for camera control 1 and camera control 2. And yep, now that's more obvious. The camera is parented to camera control 2. Camera control 2 is parented to camera control 1. So let's see what these keyframes are. I'm going to give myself a little bit more room here. So we've got one camera move that is actually scaling up, which is interesting. I don't normally animate cameras using the scale property, but that does work. And we've got X rotation. Now this is taking a little bit of time to render each frame. So I'm just going to click on this draft 3D button so things render more quickly. Now I can scrub through this almost in real time. It basically just knocks out the depth of field and lowers the quality of a lot of these settings. But I want to see what happens when I scale this up or down. Okay, so if I scale it up, it's basically zooming out. It's, I believe, actually zooming the lens out because it's scaling down. It's shifting the perspective. It's not just moving the camera in and out. I could be wrong about that, but I think that's what's happening. So I'm going to move this camera control 1 out of the way so we can focus on just this first move. So we're going from this tilted down angle, zooming out to this flat angle. And then when we bring that second control back in and move this one out of the way, we've got position that is basically running along the length of the paper, as well as scaling out a little bit and then scaling back in towards the end. So I know this is crazy looking with all of the draft 3D, but combining these two together, we have this nice movement upwards, outwards, eventually resolving on the logo and then pushing in just a little bit. All right, I'm going to turn draft 3D back off so we can see everything again. But that's a really elegant way to handle that camera move, using multiple layers of controllers to help you focus on different aspects of your camera move is a really smart way to move a 3D camera around very precisely and smoothly. I'm just going to press U to bring up all of the keyframes, and it looks like the camera also has focus distance keyframes. So that just sets the focus for the first frame, and then by this point, the focus being locked to that distance, looks like it works from there on for the rest of the scene. Cool. So if I were to design this, I would probably go into the depth of field and tie that with expressions to a controller in the project control, just because it can make such a big difference with the render time. And I'd probably even just tie it to the camera lens blur on off checkbox, just because it's basically the same thing. So why don't I do that really quickly? I'm just going to lock this effects panel so that I can see it and go back to my composition, grab that depth of field and Alt or Option click on the stopwatch, and I'll just add a variable VAR and we'll call it C for checkbox. Grab my expression pick whip and select that checkbox, semicolon to finish that off and drop down, and then write an if-else statement, which would be if, open parentheses, C equals 1, meaning if the checkbox is checked. A checkbox that is checked gives a value of 1. So if that checkbox is checked, open curly bracket, drop down, and we'll say return a value of 1. Again, that on-off for the depth of field is the same as on-off for a checkbox. So value of 1 means on. Drop down after that curly bracket and say else, open curly bracket, drop down, 0 meaning off, and my expression is finished. So if that checkbox is checked, depth of field is on. If it's unchecked, now it's disabled. So this should render more quickly now with both the camera lens blur and the actual depth of field from the 3D camera tied to that camera lens blur checkbox. So turn it on, my blur comes back, turn it off, and it renders more quickly. Cool. Let's take a look at this background grid and see how it's created. So down here we have a lines comp and a grid comp. Let's double click that grid and see what it looks like. So it's not animated, it's just a grid made up of shape layers, and that's probably repeated in here. Let's unlock that effects control so we can see, yep, sure enough, there's a rep tile. That just brings this center tile and repeats it out into this cool grid, which, by the way, this design is very nicely done in this very tight grid, all based on that square size. Very cool. And this color control, if I double tap the E key to bring up expressions, that is what's driving the fill color for that line. So everything in this project control folder with that color control null object is driving all of the colors throughout the composition. So on that grid layer, we have expressions tying very simply just a direct link from this fill color to the color control in this composition. So that's how you can create global controls throughout a template. It's just by making a bunch of expression controllers to drive all of those colors from. All right, let's jump back to the composition and then see what's inside this lines comp. So I'm going to double click in that, and this is where we get this very cool geometric pattern that's animated out. So we just have a single shape layer, which is very interesting. This is pretty complicated for having a single shape layer, and it doesn't even have any effect controls. But with it selected, we can see that there's a bounding box right around here. So if I open this up, I'm suspicious that there's going to be some repeaters. So we've got M, H, and V. I'm guessing that's for horizontal and vertical. Sure enough, there we go. It's the horizontal repeater and vertical repeater. You stack those two on top of each other, then we're splitting this out into basically a mirrored both horizontally and vertically. So inside group one, it looks like that's where all of the shapes are, all of the lines, and each one of these has a trim paths. If I press U to bring up all of the keyframes, there are a whole lot of these, and they're all timed and eased very nicely so that it just plays out in a very smooth, elegant looking trim paths animation. When you just layer things on top of each other, you do a lot of easing, you keep adding things, it can create something that looks very visually complex, even if it wasn't all that complicated to create. So that's a very cool look. And this MH group is actually not a group at all, it's a repeater. So if I were to just add a repeater and rename it, that's exactly what this is doing. And the transform controls for it are what are shifting these around. So they flip the scale to flip it on the horizontal axis, making sure that the position and anchor point are zeroed out so that it's mirroring it from that point. And then they just did the same thing again, but flipped it on the vertical axis instead of horizontally. So that's a cool little composition. And because it's a shape layer, it can scale infinitely and it will always look crisp and clean. So even though we're zoomed in nice and close here, same thing for the grid, it's always going to be nice and clean. And that's because of this collapse transformation switch. If I turn that off, you can see that quality of those lines have dropped significantly. So that's an excellent use of shape layers there. And then we have BG Matte as a track matte for this layer. It's set to Illuma Matte. If we jump into this, this is a very interesting texture. It's just a simple raster image, and it has a levels effect to drop down that white to, it looks like around 50% gray. But that's not animated. There's nothing dynamic about this comp. It's just being used as a matte. And those lines exist just back here in space. So if I turn that on, we can see that it exists right there. That is interesting because the lines come out further than that. If I solo the lines, you can see them out here. So that matte is not showing up on top of anything below this line right here. I don't know if that was a mistake or not, but it goes by so quick that you probably would never notice it. And for the rest of the composition, you never see beyond that matte anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. Although it is, missing the mark here on the outside edges. Once it zooms in, you're not gonna see that. But if I was the, art director approving this, I would say go back, scale that up a little bit so that it's always filling the frame. Even at the beginning here, I don't wanna be able to see any part of the line that's untextured. So I just scale that up, and now that matte will fill the entire frame and always give texture to those lines. Obviously, I'm being super critical here. I'm just trying to dissect every little thing that I can and see if there's anything that I can learn from it. But I hope I'm not coming across as a jerk who's just trying to pick on somebody. This is a really nicely designed template, and I'm being overly critical, but that's the point of this video. So let's take a look at this next pre-comp, center pre-comp. So this is where the logo lives, but it's not actually the logo. It's the object that draws around that logo. So we've got a nice little animation again with two shape layers. So that can be continuously rasterized. And then we have Reptile, which is repeating this the same way as those lines in the background, horizontally and then vertically. And this is actually a really interesting use of CC Reptile that I probably wouldn't have thought of. It's repeating that tile 4 times, but because they're using the tiling method of unfold, it's basically rotating each one of those sections 90 degrees. So it makes a perfect seamless square pattern out of that single tile. So that's really clever. I probably would have used a couple of mirror effects, but this is much simpler. Very cool. Then we've got a few comps with L-Edge logo and L-Edge text. So let's double click into one of these and see what it is. All right, so L-Edge, this is the logo being revealed as an outline and also with some texture. And it's made up of a lot of layers. And right here at the top, the first logo holder is set to the blend mode of Stencil Alpha. What that's going to do is not allow anything outside of the logo to be revealed, basically. It's using it as a matte for the entire stack of layers below it. So with that off, we can see what's happening a little bit more. These lines are scribbling down and up to kind of reveal the logo. And then that logo holder is trimming it to the original alpha channel of the logo. Then we have another copy of the logo set to Silhouette Luma, which if I turn off the first layer is going to actually punch a hole the shape of the logo through everything below it. So we have some effects on this one, find edges 2, and tint. So let's solo this layer, turn off that blend mode, and then see what these effects are doing. So I'm gonna turn on my transparency grid and turn off the second two effects. We've just got to find edges, which is giving us this outline view, and it is inverted so that the center of the logo becomes black. We've got find edges 2, which is just making that outline a little bit thicker, and then a tint to turn everything that was black, white, and everything else basically black. It is a little bit textured, but now that can be used as a Luma matte or a silhouette Luma blend mode to punch a hole through the whole layer stack. And combining that with the stencil alpha, we're now getting an outlined version of the logo where the outline exists inside the logo. So we're basically adding a stroke to the logo aligned to the inside of the logo. That's a very clever way of achieving that. And then we have all of these lines that are just coming in, and they're all duplicates of the same composition with this shape layer that's just animating in this very long, skinny V shape using trim paths. But that's basically just a way to make a custom scribbled line, and using it as a matte like this, it kind of reveals that outlined version of the logo. So that's cool. L-Edge logo 01. L-Edge logo 02 is probably going to do something similar. Sure enough, it does, but at a 45-degree angle rather than just vertically. And it looks like we've got a different trim pre-comp, just a different shaped V to make that scribble a little bit different. You combine those two together, but these are just kind of repeating one after another to reveal the logo a little at a time and in different directions. And we've got the same setup for the text. So outline version with the scribbles in before we get to this bigger transition where the paper basically gets brushed off. And this is something I am really interested in seeing how it was created. So let's take a look at the background, which is just a shape layer. It's a solid white color, but we have this brush matte. So let's double click into that and see what is going on here. So we've got all of these brushes, very cool textures, and they're all sliding in at these 45-degree angles. Very cool. So let's just open up brush 01 and see what is happening here. Looks like we've got two copies of the same brushstroke asset, which has transparency built in already, and it's using the second instance as an alpha matte, and that second alpha matte layer is just sweeping in to reveal the original. So we're using the shape of this brushstroke to reveal the asset in just linear way, and it gives the texture a lot of movement, a lot of texture within the texture, and you combine that a couple of different times with a couple of different brush strokes, and then duplicate them and offset them a whole bunch of times, and you get something that looks like this. That's a very cool looking animation. There's a shape layer down at the bottom called Soft, and this one is not an adjustment layer. It looks like it might be filling in the background just a little bit. If I turn it off and on, you can see that transparency grid more or less. So let me just solo this. And yeah, it's just a white solid with a fast blur enabled and very high blur level so that it's soft, but it fills in that background so we don't have any transparency showing through those brush strokes. So that's cool. And using that as an alpha matte for that background gives the background animation a very cool look. All of these brush strokes coming in, and that brush matte shows up on top of a grid, on top of the logo holder, and on top of the text holder as well. So that reveals in all of this second instance of everything we've seen in the first part of the animation, but revealing it in its final colored form with no texture applied. And that's basically the end of the animation. Now, I do want to point out that everything in this comp, almost, except for that background layer, is a 3D layer. So it's all reacting to the 3D camera. And this lines comp down at the bottom is continuously rasterized. So if I jump into there, that layer is also 3D. And that's important because if this wasn't 3D, then collapsing the transformations would not have preserved that 3D and things wouldn't have worked properly. So if I actually just disable that and show you, you see that grid just shifted around. It's not aligned anymore, so that's a very important thing to keep track of. If you're collapsing the transformations of things that need to be 3D, then make sure that 3D switch is enabled within the pre-comp as well. Now, while I was poking around in this project file, I did notice in this Do Not Edit folder into the background folder, there's this composition called Lines 1x4, and it is not used in this project at all. If we take a look at it though, it's really complex. It's another one of these compositions with a bunch of animated lines, but the pattern isn't nearly as uniform. It's very intricate. It has a whole lot of different elements and it just looks really cool. Again, it's just two shape layers with a ton of trim paths animated in offset and sped up and down. And it's all stemmed from this original icon shape layer, which doesn't have any animation at all. But That doesn't get used anywhere in the template file, so I'm not exactly sure what it's there for. It probably was left in by mistake, but it does look pretty cool. Now, another thing that I noticed is that even though this is just shape layers with trim paths, turned on, it's taking a while to render, and that's because motion blur. Motion blur is enabled and makes the simplest things take so much longer to render. If we go into our composition settings and take a look at the advanced, we have the samples per frame set to 16, meaning that for motion blur, 16 intermediate frames are being generated to produce this motion blur on every single thing that is moving with that motion blur switch enabled. So that is another thing that would really impact render time. And honestly, I would say just turn that motion blur off. It can make things look nicer, but for the majority of the things that I make, motion blur is never on. Fortunately, you can enable or disable that in any comp. So this is the render comp. If I have it on, then the motion blur will show up, and if I turn it off, then it's disabled, basically project-wide, or at least for everything nested within that comp. But if I dig deeper, I'm actually noticing that motion blur is not enabled for a lot of this stuff. So what that motion blur is really driving is just the lines animation. And that adds so much time to the render that I really just don't feel adds enough to the animation that I would never have enabled that motion blur in the first place. I mean, we're not even seeing it on any part of the scene here. It's literally just showing up where those lines are animating in. So I would just make that render just that little bit more quickly and just completely disable the motion blur. Now, as we can see, even with the changes that I've made, even with that camera lens blur turned off, it does take a little bit of time to render. But, things that look nice take time to render. I shouldn't expect this to be playing back in real time. Now, I just noticed there is some motion blur showing up right here, even though I have the switch off. So that does happen from time to time. If you're seeing things with motion blur, just turn it on and back off, and that should disable it throughout all the nested pre-comps. And now it is rendering much faster, so you can see just how much of a difference that motion blur makes. Again, I'm not totally against motion blur. It can add a lot. But if you're going to use it, I would say use it across the entire composition and not on just specific little elements. Because the camera movement of all things should be producing motion blur, if anything at all is producing motion blur. So let me just quickly add a force motion blur effect, and you'll see that apply to everything. That's what I want to see if motion blur is enabled, so that it looks more like an actual camera moving across a physical object. But that is just my opinion. Everybody has their own right to theirs. So if you like motion blur, go wild. All right, with that, I think I've pretty much dissected this project as far as I need to. I've found out some pretty interesting uses of the reptile effect and just a lot of stacking of different elements to make things work as mats that look like scribbled texture and stuff like that. It all works together very well to create a cool looking logo reveal. And those guides inside that logo holders comp is also very nice. Although I would have liked that guide to actually have lined up with that final so that I knew my logo would show up right in that circle in the same place. But overall, this is a really great template. It has a lot of really useful controls for being able to customize this. I was very quickly able to make this fit my brand and make this more like blueprint paper, which is really cool. And having those effect controls for turning off things like the sharpness, which I wasn't a big fan of, and the camera lens blur, all those things are really useful. I really do hope that this was a useful video for you and that you learned something like I did while going through this project. I kind of went through it without any prep, so I was learning things and discovering things as I was recording the video. And, just a big shout out to Envato Elements for allowing me to be able to access this entire library and be able to download this project file and just dissect it and have fun with it. And I want to give a huge thank you to all of my patrons over on Patreon for supporting videos like this one. If you're interested in seeing more content like it, then I'd ask that you consider to become a patron. You can find the link to that in the description of the video. And obviously I teach on Skillshare. I have lots of long content on that platform, all based in After Effects, teaching animation and lots of different things that you can do with the software. So if you want to see much more in-depth courses in After Effects from me, check out my Skillshare profile. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.